Hey class, and welcome to Psychology of Adjustment. This is the lecture recording for chapter 1 on adjusting to modern life. These lecture videos, of course, are meant to supplement the text. They are not intended to replace the text. So hopefully you've already read chapter 1, or maybe you're watching this before you read chapter 1 or while you read chapter, whatever way, but make sure that you're actually still reading the text. So each chapter is kind of broken up into different sections. So each section has certain learning objectives. And my recommendation is think about these learning objectives as ways to kind of test or quiz yourself. So by the end of this first section called paradox of progress, you should be able to describe 3 examples of the paradox of progress. You should be able to explain what is meant by the paradox of progress and how different theorists and psychologists in psychology have explained it. So think about maybe like using these objectives as a way to kind of quiz yourself. So maybe once this section is done, literally try doing that. See if you can describe 3 examples or try to explain to somebody else what that means, the paradox of progress. And if you can do those things, then you really have the mastery, or you have a really good understanding of that particular section. So just something to keep in mind. The learning objectives are meant to kind of focus your reading, focus your thinking, and then also you can use it as a way to kind of verify your understanding. So we're going to start with the subject called the paradox of progress, excuse me. So what does that mean? The paradox of progress. We live in a world of, especially, in the United States, in the Western developed world, we live with an abundance of technology. You're probably watching this lecture. Maybe you're watching it on your smartphone. Maybe you're watching it from a laptop or a tablet. But, we do have a lot of amazing technology that makes our life much easier, saves time. It saves effort, all kinds of things that make our life more simple and easier. Yet many people complain, don't have a lot of time. They feel like I'm overworked. Ask people, why don't you exercise? Why don't you, read more? Why don't you do this and that? And one of the biggest explanations is I just don't have enough time. But we fill our time up, and a lot of times even using these devices can kind of become time consuming in themselves. We might spend hours on it looking at our phones, but we use devices that are intended to give us back time, yet we find ourselves without as much time as we'd like. So we just have so many choices now as well. Lots of choices in terms of what to do with your free time. There are all kinds of apps on your phone. There's all kinds of services that you can get, and even just like things like, I don't know, going to the grocery store. I mean, there might be, lots of different choices of even just simple things like, hey, I want to pick out something to eat tonight. And, that abundance of choices, while it is good, can be to some extent overwhelming. Kind of leads to that feeling of choice overload. Like, I think it's really funny in Oklahoma, like I live in Oklahoma City, and this is probably common to other places in the South, but there are like fried chicken places everywhere, and sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, can I find a place that isn't a fried chicken place around here? As much as I like that food, it's, sometimes it's a little too much. So while it is nice to have choice, sometimes, and to some extent, there is such thing as too much choice, and that can even play out in psychology. So we have these modern, technologies. They give us, economic abundance, in terms of freeing up our, giving us free time, but also might lead to a sense of possession overload, where we just, regardless of the amount of stuff we get or the ease of access to stuff, like you can get on your phone and literally order anything, like from Amazon and other places. And even then, people may not oftentimes, feel, still feel unsatisfied in life, or they try to attempt to feel or fill that void, where they feel unsatisfied with the things they purchase. So ultimately, when we talk about the paradox of progress, yes, it's great. We live in an abundance of technology and things, material things, but that doesn't necessarily mean we are healthier or happier or better off for it. So I think, in terms of like adjustment to the world we live in, we have to find kind of a happy medium. How do we navigate and live within this world of abundance, but also not get caught up too easily in the tide, get caught up in it. So Some explanations. I mean, these are different explanations. I mean, there's probably a little bit of truth to each of these. Our life, while it has become simpler in some ways, there's an argument to also be made that our life is more complex and confusing and placing more of a mental demand on individuals. We also, as a culture, at least in like modern Western American culture, there's a lot of emphasis on self-improvement, always kind of being, I don't know, never truly satisfied with our sense of identity. So maybe that's kind of built culturally into, how many people perceive the world. The world is certainly, if we have all these time-saving devices, but they definitely connect the world, and it kind of makes the world feel more, busy, and maybe makes others feel overwhelmed, because now you literally have access to information about anything going on in the world at your fingertips. And for some people that might be overwhelming. So we also spend a lot more time with our technology. We're spending less time with other people, even though you might be engaging with another person, let's say on social media. You're not actually interacting with that person one-on-one in maybe a more intimate setting. So there might be some sense of intimacy deficit with our technology. And also, I mean, especially thinking about American society, we might suffer from what is considered affluenza, not influenza, but affluenza, where we have all this stuff, but it's more undermining to our sense of well-being, whether physically, emotionally, psychologically. So we might have more stuff, but it definitely is not leading to greater amounts of happiness. So paradox of progress, go back and look at those learning objectives and make sure that you can kind of understand and explain those maybe to yourself or to another person. So if you're ready, we're going to go ahead and move on to part 2, which is called the search for direction. So your learning objectives for this second section is to provide some examples of people's search for direction, like how do people find meaning or try to find meaning in their life, describe common problems when it comes to self-help books and things that you can do. Excuse me, a little fitness watch was going off. What to look for in a quality self-help book. And then finally, think about one of the last topics of this section is the philosophy kind of underlying this textbook, how you want to think about using it and thinking about the material going forward. So again, we live in this world where we have lots of stuff, but yet people are, seemingly unhappy or continuously searching for happiness or sense of meaning and things like that. So, for the most part, we live in a world where we, most of our needs are met, as far as like our physiological needs. That's not the case in other parts of the world, but certainly in like the United States and other parts of like the Western world and other parts of the world too. We think about our greatest challenge as humans is really kind of that sense of identity, that sense of meaning, kind of finding direction and purpose in our lives. When you rule out things like, okay, I need to find food, I need to find shelter, all those basic human needs, you have a lot more time and resources to free up for things like finding your purpose in life. So I think that's kind of one of the benefits of living in an advanced, and developed society in terms of technology and access to food and things like that. So there's a lot of ways in which people go about trying to find their sense of direction. And some people, it comes easier, some people not so much. And for people who might struggle with that, they might use techniques for kind of, finding meaning in their life that are either ineffective or self-destructive, kind of looking for that really quick enlightenment, that quick fix when it comes to their problems in their life. They might, some maybe off a radio personality or a podcast or something, they might look to kind of quote unquote experts about, these things that may or may not actually be experts. So, and another really useful tool, I think, and it can be useful in some sense, are self-help books, books that you can kind of read at your own pace and new ways of thinking about your life. I'm no stranger to those books. Some are really effective, some are not. Some are based on actual research, some are not. Some are more maybe pop psychology, but they're definitely not all equal in terms of their content and then their value. So they can be good, especially they do exist. But more often than not, there are a lot of them out there that are just not that good. They're probably not effective, and in some cases might be harmful. So things you might want to look for, maybe if you're like going to Barnes and Noble or on Amazon or somewhere and you're perusing like a self-help book, you can kind of peruse maybe the chapters, or you can peruse like the back of the book or reviews or things like that. And things you want to look for is if the message is maybe too vague, it's more like kind of loaded with like psychobabble, It's not based on actual research. Ideally, you want to find a book that has like citations that are coming from actual research. Not really giving, if the book is being vague in the sense that the directions aren't explicit, this is what you should do. It's much more vague. Then it's probably something you should be skeptical about. Or if they're proposing maybe adopting more of a narcissistic lifestyle, very self-centered, that to some extent, maybe there's a time and place to be self-centered and focus on yourself, but like maybe in terms of self-help that probably shouldn't be the crux of the dominant perspective in your self-help approach. So what are things that you should look for in terms of a good self-help book? Ones that are more realistic, ones that are not promising you like a quick change, like an instant fix. We live in an instant gratification society. So it's makes sense that we want things and we want them now. But big changes in your life, aren't going to come so easily. Like you're not going to find all the answers to life in a book. I hate to tell you that. Look for the credentials of the authors, like actually Google them, look them up, or is this person a credible, researcher, scientist, expert in the field, or are they just somebody who's kind of coined a term and they're running with it and it's not even based on, science or research. So that kind of bleeds into part there. Topic 3 is look for books that actually have bases that are grounded in science. And we'll talk a little more about what that looks like in subsequent slides. You want books, self-help books that are more detailed, more explicit about what you are being asked to do, not vague, not like the interpretation isn't going to be ambiguous, like they're very clear about what you should do. And also focusing more specific on a problem behavior, not, that you want to be as specific as possible. Like you're not going to just read a book about being happy, whatever that means. You might want to find a book about reducing social media usage. You might find a self-help book about, cutting out smoking or other kind of bad habits, but make sure it is a specific problem or behavior you're trying to address. So this textbook is obviously it's not a self-help book, but you might find areas of it, reading the textbook helpful in your own life, being able to apply elements of psychology. So the idea behind this textbook, the adjustment textbook, is that it's built or written around the idea that knowledge about the principles of psychology, some that you learned in intro psych and maybe lifespan, some that you're going to learn here as well. There are things that you could apply in your everyday life, and they are research, they are scientifically based. They're not just, some guru trying to share their experts. These are ideas that have been tested and hold up pretty well. The idea is we want you to, after reading this textbook, after watching these series of lectures, to be more critical in terms of your attitude towards issues related to self-improvement or adjustment. So we want you to be skeptical but also open as well. So and hopefully this textbook will open more doors than it closes, in terms of maybe it'll encourage you to apply these ideas in your real life and maybe ask more questions and dig deeper and into your own experiences. So that's kind of the goal of this textbook, of the adjustment textbook. Okay, so thinking about psychology of adjustment, we're going to kind of frame it within the frame of psychology, obviously. So we're going to first describe the key facets of psychology and explain the concept of adjustment. By the end of this section, section 3, you should be able to do both of these things. So what do we mean by psychology? It's kind of a loaded term in the sense that there are multiple parts. Our textbook defines psychology as the scientific study of behavior and the physiological and mental processes that underlie it, and is the profession that applies this accumulated knowledge of science to practical problems. So we're scientifically studying behavior and mental processes and applying those to understand real world problems that human beings engage. So we can kind of unpack that. Like, for one, what do we mean by behavior? It means sort of any overt or observable response. Like right now, if you're listening and taking notes, that's a behavior. Right now, I'm talking to you, I'm using my computer, I'm using Zoom. These are all observable things. So that's the kind of framework. I mean, this is probably very similar to the definition you encountered in intro psych. It's just kind of expanding upon it a little bit. But we're talking about, when we talk about the psychology, that's what we're saying. And adjustment just simply means the processes with which we manage or cope with demands or challenges on everyday life. So from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, you are going to encounter demands for your time, demands for your energy, your resources. Some challenges will be bigger than others, some will be stressful, some will not. But how do you adjust to those demands? And so we're using psychology to try to understand how different people or how people, adjust to the world around them. So what do we now? We're going to kind of unpack that definition even further, looking at the scientific approach to behavior. So really focusing on that science side of things. Your objective should be explain the nature of empiricism, the advantages and disadvantages, or the advantages of the scientific approach, describe the experimental method, making sure you understand the difference between an independent and dependent variable, experimental control groups. Some of this, probably all of this should be familiar maybe from intro psych, but it's never a bad thing to review. Distinguish between positive and negative correlation and explain what the size of a correlation coefficient means. Describe 3 correlational research methods, and then compare and contrast the advantages, disadvantages of experimental and correlational research. So again, probably a lot of this is review, but again, never hurts to have a refresher. So we are talking about, when we say that science or psychologists are scientifically studying behavior and mental processes, we're talking about collecting empirical data or approaching these problems from the point of view of empiricism, which is defined as the premise that our knowledge, that human knowledge, can be acquired through observation. We can directly observe in order to learn. So the idea is we can use the science of psychology, that's based on actual careful systematic observations rather than just trying to rely on what we might consider common sense, because 1, common sense isn't always common, and 2, it's not always truthful. So we are taking an empirical approach. Psychology, the gold standard of psychology is the experimental method, which allows us to actually derive cause and effect. It is a research method where we can actually manipulate variables, the independent variable, the one that actually is manipulated or changed, and then we can measure the change in the dependent variable. So independent is what we manipulate, dependent variable is what you measure. This is the primary method which psychologists use to understand the world around them when it comes to phenomena of behavior and mental processes. Now, there are other methods, but this again is the gold standard because we can talk about things like cause and effect. So the independent variable, just a quick refresher from the previous slide, independent variable is what you manipulate. So for example, in research, when it comes to like therapy, maybe the independent variable, one person gets the form of therapy, the control group does not. We manipulate who receives the treatment. Maybe we want an experimental group to receive the treatment, a control group just as a baseline for comparison, and we have those 2 groups to compare based on the changes in the independent variable. The dependent variable is what you are measuring. So let's say it's a new form of therapy to treat depression, we can compare scores on a depression inventory. Maybe that's our dependent variable. The participants take a depression inventory before, during, and after treatment. Same for the control group, and we compare. So kind of already jumped ahead, we have typically experimental research has 2 groups. You have the experimental group, the one who receives the actual treatment. The control group is the one who does not. They are typically used for a baseline of comparison. So let's say we have 100 people who are experiencing major depression. 50 of them receive the experimental therapy. 50 of them do not, just to compare. Maybe let's see how they all turn out 6 months from now in terms of their depression scores. So can we see if the experimental treatment significantly reduces depression compared to no treatment at all? So, this is kind of what this might look like in an actual hypothetical scenario. Let's say we have a hypothesis, our educated guess, anxiety increases our desire to affiliate. So when we're anxious, we might want to reach out to others. So we choose subjects, and usually in this case, it would probably be college students. We have an experimental group, we have a control group, so 2 different groups. The experimental group receives the treatment. both groups go to an experimental setting with Dr. Zilstein. The manipulation happens here. The independent variable, they're told shocks will be very painful, which creates a situation of high anxiety. The control group is told shocks will be mild and painless, inducing low anxiety, excuse me. So we want to compare these two situations. Afterwards, both groups are measured on a dependent variable. Would you prefer to wait alone or with others? This question is meant to measure the desire to affiliate. Results, we can analyze those, but in this situation, the results suggest high anxiety group wanted to wait with others more than the low anxiety group. Therefore, anxiety does increase desire to affiliate. So this, we're actually able to manipulate variables to derive some kind of cause and effect statement. And that's the gold standard of why experimental research is so powerful, is if we can manipulate variables, then we can see if we can control some variables, manipulate others. Obviously, you can't control for everything. We can actually derive cause and effect. We can see what does anxiety cause an individual to affiliate more than low anxiety. So this is the gold standard. So it does allow us to derive cause and effect. However, there are disadvantages to the experimental design. I mean, obviously you can control some variables, but you can't control all. Ethical reasons, like you can't manipulate everything. Like, some things can be manipulated, some things can't ethically. Like, for example, you're wanting to kind of understand the relationship between like cigarette smoking and cancer. You can't ethically have a research experiment where you have, let's take 50 people and have them start smoking and 50 people who don't smoke, and let's just see like what that affects on like that would be unethical and wouldn't work out too well. So it's a great technique, but obviously it's not perfect. A lot of times individuals, before they do experimental research, might start off with correlational research, which is simply just looking at the relationship between two variables. Is there a relationship at all? And this is typically measured mathematically on a correlation coefficient that ranges from -1 to 0 to +1. The closer it is to -1 or +1, we say that it is stronger. The closer it is to 0, we say it's weaker. Negative, and we also think about the direction of the relationship. Is it positive or negative? So a positive correlation means, hey, when X goes up, so does Y. These two variables covary in the same direction. Whereas a negative correlation means they covary in opposite directions. So as scores on X go up, scores on Y go down. And this is kind of reflected, in graphs. We can kind of think about it in a hypothetical situation, a negative correlation, as your frequency of absences goes down, we would expect your exam scores to go up. So if you're in class more, we would expect your exam scores to go up. A positive correlation also might be, your high school GPA tends to correlate pretty well with your college GPA. Like if you're a really good student, if you're a 4.0 student in high school, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a 4.0 student in college, but it's a pretty good predictor. Maybe you still get good grades, even if they're not a 4.0. So, mentioned this already, the strength of the correlation is measured from 1 to -1. 0 in the middle indicates there's no association. And this is just a nice kind of chart letting you know. So as we get closer to -1, we might say it's a high correlation either way, closer to 1, regardless if it's negative or positive high. Closer to 0.5, it's moderate. Low is anything less than 0.25. 0 would be nothing or getting close to negligible. So that's a great way to, it's a lot of times correlation is a preliminary to experimental research. Some ways in which you can collect correlational research. You might do naturalistic observation where you view and observe people or organisms in their natural habitat, and this is kind of like people watching, but obviously not in a creepy way. There's also case studies where you can take in-depth, data about an individual or collection of individuals experiencing a unique phenomena. And there's also surveys. If you want to collect a lot of data, at one time from a large group of people, surveys are great. You have these questionnaires, ideally, that are structured and meant to capture in that moment in time different behaviors or attitudes. So correlation is cool, but it only tells us about the existence of a relationship. It doesn't really tell us, it doesn't necessarily tell us a cause and effect, but there are still advantages. For one, it allows us to kind of explore the relationship between variables that aren't necessarily things that are suitable or ethical for actual manipulation in a research setting. So we might look at, for example, the effects of psychological trauma on male versus females. Like, you can't ethically subject people to trauma and some people not, but if some people have endured trauma already, we can definitely collect data from those folks and try to understand this phenomenon more. So this kind of gives you a broader array of phenomena to study, but obviously kind of limited in scope. Like, you just can't derive cause and effect. We can say they're related, but we can't say how they are related. So it could be that X is causing Y, it could be Y is causing X, or it could be some other third variable, Z, that's involved. So we just, based on the, what correlation tells us, it tells us a lot, but not the whole story, obviously. So, and this is just kind of visually, what this might look like. So X, Y, are these two, which way is the direction of the relationship going, or is there some other value? So, relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction, there's certainly probably a large correlation there, but we don't know what is driving the bus. Is it relationship satisfaction increases sexual satisfaction, or vice versa? Or is there some other third variable, compatibility of values, for example, that might come into effect? So yeah, it's a lot of different ways to collect data in psychology, and there are kind of advantages and disadvantages to both. So either way, we can actually apply an empirical approach to addressing a problem that has been plaguing human beings for millennium, centuries, whatever, since our existence, and that is trying to be happy. So looking at the roots of happiness, what actually leads to happiness. So your objectives for this section, I think this is section 4 now, identify the various factors that are surprisingly unrelated to happiness, describe the factors that are somewhat important to well-being, and then be able to summarize the conclusions about determinants of happiness. So common sense would say, about the, happiness, there are all kinds of things. We think to some extent we might debate on whether money buys happiness, or being married, or going to church, or all these different things. And so to try to understand what makes people happy, surveys have been sent out. Lots of different survey studies have been used to understand, the sense of subjective well-being, your overall sense of life satisfaction or overall happiness. And so that's what we're going to look at next. What we found out from these different surveys, this confluence of survey data, what isn't very important? Well, money. There's only a correlation between 0.12 and 0.20. If you go back to that chart, that means it's a pretty weak correlation. Means, money probably to some extent does factor into happiness, but after a certain point, it just doesn't, it doesn't matter. Age is not related. Gender also has little subjective or impact on our sense of well-being. Parenthood, some people will swear by it as parents. They're like, oh, this is the happiest I've ever been was when I became a parent. And definitely there's probably some truth to that. And there's also parents who will tell you how stressed they are. So really, it's probably to some degree that the good and the bad kind of balance each other out. Intelligence, no association between intelligence and IQ. Physical attractiveness, people who are considered more attractive have advantages in society, but again, kind of like money, the correlation tends to be pretty weak. What are some things that are somewhat important in terms of your happiness? Well, health. Typically, we see a correlation around 0.32, so a little bit more. It's kind of getting into that weak to moderate. Social relations, how many good quality friendships and social relationships we have, we tend to be more happier. Religious beliefs, people who are spiritual, who are religious, tend to be more happy. Having time for leisure activity also tends to go pretty well with your sense of well-being. Culture, in terms of being in an affluent nation, probably having more of your needs met psychologically, emotionally, fiscally, things like that. People tend to be more happy. What are some things that tend to be very important? Well, not only having relationships, but the degree of satisfaction. We see men and women, married people are happier than people who are single or divorced because they have these satisfying relationships. Work, being satisfied with your work life is strongly related to your sense of happiness. We also see there is a component of genetics and personality, like adopting more of an extroversion personality style or personality type, whereas neuroticism. So think back to think back to what you learned about in personality theory from intro psych, the big five, Canoe. Certain personality types or traits are correlated with happiness positively or negatively. So, extroverts, we notice that social activity probably it correlates pretty well with happiness, but we don't know which way it goes in terms of that relationship, and maybe the underlying factor could be that sense of extroversion or that personality trait of extroversion. So the conclusions of this is that your sense of well-being or happiness, are more important, than objective measures. Happiness, of course, is very relative. Some people who live in poverty are completely happy, and other people who are rich are miserable. So, I don't know, it's all relative about your, kind of how you view things. It's relative to how we see others around us. It's relative to our own expectations. And it really, people aren't always great about knowing, what will actually make them happy. We call this affective forecasting, being able to kind of predict your emotional reactions to future events, like winning the lottery. Like some people would think, oh my gosh, I'd be so happy. And if they actually did win the lottery, maybe they were happier at first, but after some time, not so much. So people typically adapt to their circumstances. This is called hedonic adaptation. We tend to use this as a framework for judging pleasant or unpleasant situations in our experience, but we use it kind of relatively, within the scope of things. So like if everyone around you has an abundance of things but you're the only one who doesn't, you may not be so happy. But if everyone has an abundance of things and you also have a lot of things, you're probably going to be kind of like everyone else. You're going to be, you're going to judge your experience to be pleasant rather than unpleasant. All right. So last thing I want to mention is another aspect of applying psychology in your everyday life is using psychology to study better, to improve your academic performance. So this last little bit is about how to be a better studier, how to read and use the textbook in this class and in others more effectively. So at the end of this section, you should be able to list 3 steps for developing sound study habits, discuss strategies for improving reading comprehension, getting more out of your lectures like the one you're watching now, describe various study strategies that can also aid in memory. So maybe some of these ideas will jar or ring a bell from intro psych in your chapter on memory. So some really good concrete habits that you can start to use right now to become a better studier, a better learner, a better college student. Set up a schedule for studying. Like I wouldn't do it just one day a week. I would probably try to find a way to distribute your studying, even if it's in small doses throughout the week, but try to create a schedule, one that works with your time allowances, and try to stick with that as best as you can. Also find a place that is you're able to study, where you're able to concentrate. You want a quiet environment. Maybe you go to the library, maybe you find a quiet place in your house, but make sure it is a place you can consistently go and concentrate. And don't be afraid to reward your studying. Maybe after a long day of studying, take a break and go get Starbucks, or take some time and watch your favorite show on Netflix. Do something to kind of reward your hard work and, kind of give yourself something to look forward to. So here's an example of a study plan. Of course, this is obviously, you could screenshot this or create something like this for yourself, but look at your week, maybe on an hourly basis, and figure out, okay, where do I have time to study? If I'm going to be working these times, if I'm sleeping from these times, and I have class these times, where can I fit time to study? And if you can see it on the schedule, I think it'll help you maybe get over some of the anxiety that some people have about, oh my gosh, I don't have enough time. When you can actually visibly see your time, it puts things into more perspective. So what can you do to improve your reading as you're reading this text and other texts? Maybe preview the reading assignments section by section. A lot of times there are prompts at the beginning and end of text to kind of help you think about what you are about to read or what you just read. Use those. Actively process the meaning of information, like try to connect it back to your own experience. Think about what you read, think about examples in the textbook, and try to come up with your own. Like try to think about, oh, well, the textbook used this example. Let me think of my own personal example, and you're going to make more deeper connections. Identify the key ideas of each paragraph, maybe each paragraph, or even maybe each page. Try to maybe just, what's the gist? What if I had to sum it up or tweet it, put it in one sentence? What does it mean? Review key ideas after each section, terms like in the glossary, things like that. Use the chapter outlines, the summaries, all of those tools that are kind of presented for you already, and those learning objectives that I talked about with the PowerPoint. Use those as a way to guide your studying and make sure you understand. What can you do to get more out of your lectures? Use active listening procedures. I don't want you to just take notes and just write exactly what I'm saying. Try to, listen, take away the key points, but put them in your own words so it really sticks. Read ahead. Ideally, you should have read chapter 1 before you read or watched this lecture. I think you'll have a better sense of what's going on. If the lecture is thoughts, the words I'm saying, try to put them in your own words. The more it's coming from your own words, the more it's going to stick. Look for cues, things that, what might be important. If your professor stops and talks about a certain idea again and again and again, well, that's probably important. Ask questions. I know right now it's probably difficult to ask questions. Like, obviously you can't do it live, but you can obviously send me questions. If you have questions after watching this, post them in the YouTube video, or post them on where you're watching this from. But ask questions if you don't understand. That's what I'm here for. And lastly, how can you use techniques related to memory to improve your learning? Give yourself lots of time to practice. Don't just study the night before, like say a test is done. You should be practicing often to the point where you feel like you have overlearned something. You would much rather overlearn something than underlearning. Distribute your practice, break it up over multiple days, and make sure you're organizing the information you're studying. The notes you use, again, making sure those are organized in a way that are in your own words and that you understand, and it makes it easier to kind of, to follow along, enhance your retention. Make the material more personal and meaningful, connect it back to your own experiences, embrace mnemonic devices. These are any kind of strategy for enhancing your memory, verbal mnemonics, acrostics, acronyms, things like that, visual methods, method of loci. I mean, all of these are things that you can read about more in your textbook, obviously, and use to your advantage. I mentioned the big 5 personality traits a few slides ago. A mnemonic device for those is canoe or ocean. That's just a simple mnemonic device to help you remember those different aspects of personality. So anyways, this is an example of the method of loci, where let's say if you wanted to remember, like, I don't know, 5 different things you wanted to get from the store, you could imagine those objects at different places in your house. Like, oh, I need, cat food. I don't know what this is here. I need bananas or whatever. And you kind of visually create in your mind places where those things are. And it just kind of gives you, it's connecting something you're trying to memorize to something that's personal, and you're able to better remember it. So anyways, that's going to do it for chapter 1. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll be back with chapter 2 shortly. So yeah. Post questions in the YouTube channel, or post them where you're watching from. Maybe you're watching on Canvas, whatever works for you. But let me know if you have any questions. All right, take care. Stop recording.